Hello and welcome. My name is Mark Horseman, data evangelist with DATAVERSITY. We would like to thank you for joining the current installment of the monthly DATAVERSITY webinar series, Real World Data Governance with Bob Seiner. Today, Bob's topic du jour is data and AI governance in the age of data democratization. Just a couple of points to get us started. Due to the large number of people that attend these sessions, you will be muted during the webinar. If you would like to chat with us or chat with each other, we certainly encourage you to do so. And to note, Zoom chat defaults to send it just to panelists, but you may absolutely switch that to network with everyone. For questions, we will be collecting them by the Q&A section. To find chat and Q&A panels, you'll see the icons for those features in the bottom middle of your screen. As always, we will send a follow-up email within a couple of business days containing links to the slides, a recording of this session, and any additional information requested throughout the webinar. Now, let me introduce to you our speaker for the series, Bob Seiner. Bob is the president and principal of KIK Consulting and Educational Services, the publisher emeritus of the data administration newsletter, tdan.com. Bob was recently awarded the DAMA Professional Award for significant and demonstrable contributions to the data management industry. Bob specializes in non-invasive data governance, data stewardship, and metadata management solutions. And with that, I will hand the floor over to Bob to start his presentation. Hello and welcome, my good friend.
Hey, Mark, can you hear me okay? Are we sounding good?
Sure can. You sound wonderful.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate your taking your time out of your busy schedule to sit with us today for an hour as we talk about a very important subject. It's interesting because there's probably about as many buzzwords in the name of this webinar as any of the webinars that I've done over the years that I've been doing this. But it's interesting with the title of this webinar too. It's Data and AI Governance in the Age of Data Democratization. I didn't know, Mark, whether or not I need to call it democratization or I forget how you pronounced it, but it could be either data and AI governance in the age of data democratization, or you could actually flip that and you could say data democratization in the because we are certainly in the age of data and AI governance. So these two subjects are very closely related. The term data democratization is not used that prevalently in the industry yet, but I'd like to start with a good definition of that, and then we'll kind of get into how we need to consider data and AI governance to be important in this age where everybody wants access to the data right now. They want the data to be democratized. So the data for everybody means governance for everybody, and we're going to talk about that today. But again, thank you for spending the time with us today. This webinar is actually webinar number 164, and there's going to be 167 of them because we're going to retire the series at the end of the year. But I'm really happy to have you here. We got some great subjects coming up. I'm going to talk to you about the next one, but I hope you'll join with us as we count down the third, the second, and the final webinars of the year for the Real World Data Governance series. Before I get started, I always spend a couple minutes talking about some of the things that I'm involved in. You obviously know about this webinar series. It's always on the third Thursday of the month. And next month, I'm going to be talking about the role of data governance in kind of facilitating the transformations that are taking place in industry, the AI transformations, and the digital transformation that people have been talking about for some time, but really talk specifically about the role of data governance in facilitating those things to happen. I have talked often about non-invasive data governance. I've written 3 books on the subject. The most recent one came out this year called Non-Invasive Data Governance Unleashed. I got a teaser for you. I'm actually working on a 4th book that's going to be released in early 2026. I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go through the webinar. I have online learning plans available through DATAVERSITY on non-invasive data governance and non-invasive metadata governance, as well as business glossaries, dictionaries, and catalogs. If you want to find me, you can find me on LinkedIn, or you can look me up at kikconsulting.com, which I refer to as the home of non-invasive data governance. And in my spare time, I'm also an adjunct faculty member at Carnegie Mellon University here in my hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in their Chief Data and AI Officer program. So what am I going to talk about today? And the way I typically break out my webinars is I have four pretty important subjects that I want to address, but then I want to also save maybe 5 or 10 minutes at the end to go through some success stories for the topic of the day or the topic du jour, as Mark had shared earlier. And so the things that I want to talk to you about today is if we're going to make data available to everybody, if we're going to make data access easier to everybody, there are certainly some governance challenges that we're going to need to address. So I'm going to talk about some of those governing challenges. If we're going to give access to people with data, and we're also then going to require some level of policy around the management of the access to the data, there's going to need to be some balance between data access and between the policies that a lot of data governance programs are putting in place. We'll talk about another consideration for data and AI governance in this day of democratization is how do we ensure that the data is good, that the data has integrity, that there's quality, and how do we do that in an environment where the data is dispersed amongst people within the organization? How do we empower employees? I'm going to talk about that, and then I'm going to wrap up with a handful of success stories around governance in this age of data democratization. I always start my webinars just sharing with you my definitions of data governance, of data stewardship, of even just governance and stewardship to begin with. I have a longer definition for data governance where I say that it's the execution and enforcement of authority over the definition, production, and usage of data and data related assets. Well, people are looking more for a definition of what it means to govern something. So I've kind of pared back the definition to really just a definition about governance. And if it's AI governance or it's information governance or it's people governance or whatever you're governing, at the end of the day, you need to execute and enforce authority. And I know that's worded quite strongly. And I talk about non-invasive data governance. So we'll talk a little bit about how you can execute and enforce authority in a way that's non-invasive or non-threatening to the organization. But that's the definition. That is basically the definition of governance. Because no matter what you're governing or what approach you're taking, at the end of the day, you need to execute and enforce authority over it in order for it to be governed. I talk about stewardship kind of the same way. I have a longer definition for data stewardship, but um, it's really formalized accountability. If you believe that anybody in your organization that either defines or produces or uses data as part of their job, and they're being held formally accountable for how they define, produce, and use data, they're a steward of the data. So people are already defining, producing, and using data. I think that's inevitable that that's happening within your organization. But if people are being held accountable for how they're doing those things, they're stewards. Stewardship is basically formalized accountability, and data stewardship is formalized accountability for the management of data or for the definition, production, and usage of data. So that being said, kind of the trimmed back definition of data governance is it's the execution and enforcement of authority over data. And since we're talking about AI governance as well, I think the definition goes well with the AI governance as well, where it's really the execution and enforcement of authority over AI. And that could be privacy, it could be regulatory concerns, it could be any of the concerns or challenges that you have with data around AI. In order to govern that, you're going to need to execute and enforce authority over that. So again, I just think the execution and enforcement of authority, it's worded strongly, but I think it also portrays what we're trying to do when we're trying to govern something. The last definition that I want to talk to you about today is data democratization itself. And you can read through the definition quickly, making trusted data accessible to the right people at the right time. I took a kind of a more standard definition to data democratization, and I added a governing flavor to it. So not only am I saying, and I'm going to actually, you shouldn't read the definition too quick. You should actually slow it down and read it this way and look at the things that are underlined. So making trusted data, well, how do you define trusted data in your organization? And what effort is going to be required in order for the data to be trusted, especially by the people who are going to now have access to that data? So making that trusted data accessible. I'm not a highly technical person, but there's a lot of considerations when you're making the data that is now trusted accessible to people. And then it's not only just making it accessible to people, it's making it accessible to the right people and providing it to them at the right time. So you can provide data to people all day long, but unless it's there when they need it, you're not really helping them out. So in the age of data democratization, we're making trusted data accessible to only those people that should have access to it at the time that it's going to be most beneficial to them without turning governance into that roadblock or turning governance into a free-for-all within the organization. So this is really what we're trying to do in the age of data democratization is data for everybody, but that data needs to be governed. So one of the things that I've started to do in this webinar series, not all 164 episodes so far, but the last several for certain, is I like to kind of get a couple things off my chest as we're getting started. So I have a before we get started session, and this one's basically broken into three things that I want to talk about. The first one is if it's going to be data for everybody, then the truth is if your organization is going to avoid risk or they're really going to get the most value out of the data, it needs to be governance for everybody too. So the first topic that I'm going to talk about once I get through these three ideas is how do we go about navigating governance challenges in this day where everybody wants access to the data. And then I want to talk about, perhaps we've just been talking about data governance wrong all these years. And I have a couple of things to share with you there. And then what I want to do is bridge that gap between this new narrative that I want to talk about with data governance and data democratization, since it's getting to the point where everybody wants to have access to the data that they need and really should have access to the data they need, but it has to be governed data and their activities need to be governed as well. So another thing I wanted to talk about before we get started is just a couple things that are important to me right now. A lot of people, I've had a couple conversations even in the last couple of days about people don't like using the term data governance. They talk about using enablement instead. And I don't really have a problem with the term enablement, but I have written an article or two on LinkedIn where I talk about data enablement being important, but it's also kind of too passive. We can enable people to do things, but it doesn't mean that they're going to do them. So I've started to position and to present data governance as a catalyst to make things happen within the organization. It's kind of an accelerator to make things happen. And when I told you I was going to tease you about a book that's going to be coming out next year, it's going to be focused on this concept as using data governance as kind of an accelerator to get things done within the organization. I've also issued a white paper with a partner of mine titled Change Management Powered Data Governance, because data governance is not going to be successful unless people change their behavior. And in order to get people to change their behavior, that's really what change management is all about. And then there's another aspect to it too, which is data literacy and data fluency. So people can only govern and people can only really leverage and make use of things that they understand. So we got to focus on governance. We've got to focus on change management. We've got to focus on data fluency as well. And I'm referring to it now as data catalyst cubed. Again, it's that accelerator to make things happen that kind of bring together non-invasive data governance, change management, and data fluency. Another thing I'm going to talk about also in one of the case studies at the end is how an organization took kind of a stealthy approach to data governance. And I'm working for some federal government organizations here in the US. And you know what? They don't want data governance is not at the top of everybody's list of things that they want to do. We kind of need to follow an under the radar pattern. So let's get things done. Let's focus on outcomes instead of outputs, but let's do it in kind of a stealthy way. And then again, the picture at the bottom of the screen here is just an example of a catalyst. And I don't know if you knew this or not, but if you add potassium permanganate I bet you Mark knew this for sure. If you add potassium permanganate to hydrogen peroxide, it's going to be the catalyst to turn it into water and to oxygen. I can say that about Mark because I've known Mark for so long. The last thing I want to say before I start jumping to more of the subjects is let's kind of bridge that gap between data democratization to data and AI governance. We know that data democratization, everything that's written about data democratization, is all about the opportunity that it is creating. When we can empower people by getting data into their hands, that's going to introduce a lot of new ideas and things into your organization, but it's also going to introduce a lot of risk into the organization. So data democratization, the data needs to be governed because basically trust is the foundation of democratization, and trust actually works two ways. So not only does democratization, this is more times than I've ever said that word, democratization really only works when people trust the data that they're using, and when the people that are using the data can be trusted to use the data in the way that it's intended to be used. So it's actually kind of a two-way street that we need people to trust the data and we need to trust the people that have access to the data. And the one way that we can do that is to make certain that those people are educated and know the data and are literate around the data. And governance as a catalyst, as I said before, accelerating things like democratization within the organization. Don't pose governance just as an enabler, taking a passive view, take more of an active view where you can use governance as an accelerator to make things like data democratization happen within your organization. All right, so I've used almost a quarter of the time. And I want to talk now about those specific subjects and then save time for the case studies at the end. So the first thing I want to do is share like a handful of ways to navigate some of these challenges that we're going to have in the era of democratizing data. And you can see the subjects I want to talk about: the myth of governance as being something that's controlling within the organization. If people view that, they're certainly not going to, if they view governance that way, they're not going to view governance as being fun or interesting for them to do. I know governance and fun aren't usually used in the same expression, but if people think of governance as control, there is some eye opening for them. We need to educate them and let them know that governance is not all about control. If we're going to give data to people and we're going to trust them and they're going to want to use it right away, we need to balance speed with trust. We need to make sure that we're paying attention to that shadow data and shadow AI within the organization. Take more of a role-based focused on accountability in what I'm referring to as a flat data world, and then talk about good inputs and good outputs will lead to good outputs. So if there's one message that I really want you to take away from this webinar, it's the one that kind of fell across the screen at the bottom. And that's that democratization is going to require governance more than ever. So if your organization is getting to this point that they want to democratize their data, you can't do that without governance, or you're going to have that free for all, or you're going to be putting your organization at risk. And so people think there's still a lot of organizations that think that data governance has to be about locking down the data. Um, well, if we're going to democratize and give data to people and provide access to them, we don't really want to restrict them. We really want to guide them and enable safe and kind of purposeful behaviors from them when they're using that data. So we need to change the tune of governance as a controlling factor. It enables the safe access, but in ways that you don't really lock down the data. And the misperception is that it's going to slow down adoption and trust of data, when in fact, in my experience, it's always been the opposite. Um, and so we just have to keep in mind that democratization of the data is going to require more governance than ever, and that governance is more than just controlling who gets access to what. We want to consider balance. And one of the other ways to navigate the governance challenges is to balance that speed with that trust. So if we give people quick access to the data, we have to be careful that we're not giving them access in a reckless way that creates unnecessary risk for the organization. Um, we actually want to implement governance in a way that provides some level of confidence in them that they can move fast, but that they understand the data. And the governed data is giving access to of the right data to the right people at the right time. Um, in previous webinars in years gone by, and there have been many of those, I refer to it as the Data Governance Bill of Rights, getting the right people involved with the right data at the right time to make the right decision. And the word rights is in quotes. Well, this is really what we're trying to do. Trying to give access to these people. We want to give them speedy access to the data, but they've got to trust the data, and we've got to trust the idea that they're going to know what to do with the data once they have access to it. Because that's a big concern for a lot of organizations. They want to make data available, but unless they're providing the knowledge and the know-how about the data, it's a big risk because then the data and your AI models may not work properly, or they may not work the way that the data is intended to be used. Another one of the challenges that we need to navigate in this era of data democratization is the shadow data and the shadow AI. So we've got a lot of different organizations that are just testing the water with data governance. So if there's no formal governance in place for what they're doing, they're going to create their own workarounds. So you've got this shadow IT, you've got this shadow AI emerging in organizations, and they're not necessarily talking to each other. It's great for innovation, it's great for discovery, but a lot of times it undermines the trust and it exposes organizations to risk. So we have to, one of the challenges that we're going to need to face with governance in this new era is that risk of getting our arms around the things that are happening within the organization for shadow IT and for shadow data and shadow AI. So certainly that is another one of the challenges that we need to face. And if you've been to my webinars before, you know I like to say that everybody in the organization is a steward of the data, is a steward for the organization. If you look up in the dictionary what a steward is, the definition is that it is somebody who takes care of something for somebody else. I've mentioned before, I drove by a church recently in my community that said they had a billboard outside that said, "We are a stewardship community. We are here to take care of each other." So, basically, everybody in the organization has some relationship to the data. They either define it or produce it or use it, or they do two of the three or all of the three. We've got to leverage the accountability based on people's relationships to the data. So everyone has a relationship to the data. If they're being held formally accountable for it, they are stewarding the data, taking care of the data for the organization. So therefore, I say everybody is a data steward. So we need to make certain that, again, one of the challenges that people have in this era of giving everybody access to data is the clarification around the roles and responsibilities. So, starting with the premise that potentially everybody in the organization is a steward, we need to make certain our governance programs are able to recognize that and handle that moving forward. And the last topic I want to talk about here for these challenges is that, we know that good outputs are going to come only if we have good inputs. So the AI and the analytical activities that are taking place in your organization, the results that are coming out of them are amplifying problems within the data. They're amplifying the strengths, but they're also amplifying the weaknesses in the data. So the AI and analytics are amplifying whatever data they receive. And certainly the outputs reflect the quality of the inputs, and poor inputs are going to lead to flawed or misleading results. Governance is certainly a way to start to address some of those challenges. It ensures that the inputs into the AI models and the analytics are accurate and trustworthy. All right, we're going to move on to the second subject that I want to address with you, and that is how do we go about balancing data access with the governance policies that are in place? So first thing we know we don't want to create is anarchy within the organization, or where people are just randomly accessing data that they shouldn't be accessing. So let's talk about accessing data without anarchy. Let's talk about, again, the role-based activities, using policies instead of them being presented as roadblocks. Let's present them as guide rails to people when they're accessing the data. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that data catalyst effect that includes change management and data governance and data literacy, and then a little bit more about stealth policy integration as well. So some of the things to consider when you're trying to balance data access with your governance policies is that data democratization is not intended just to open the floodgates and give people access to data that they don't know, that they don't understand, that they don't trust. Um, so governance is going to need to play a role in providing that structure and that clarity to that data. We don't want anarchy around the data. We don't want to open the floodgates. We need to make certain that if we're going to democratize the data, that there has to be a level of governance around it. And that open access to data, there needs to be a structure associated with it. Really, the intention of governance is to prevent chaos, to prevent data misuse in the organization. It doesn't mean that you need to go and hit people over the head with a hammer and tell them what to do. They're already governing. Governing is already taking place within the organization. As I've said many times, it may be informal. And because it's informal, it can be inefficient and ineffective. So we just need to recognize who's doing what with data and kind of formalize that, even as we start to give people greater access to more data across the organization. So again, speaking about those roles, people already have relationships to data within the organization. I limit it to the three. I say define, produce, and use. I've actually challenged clients and presentations I've given. Are there any other actions beyond defining data, producing data, and using data? It seems like every action seems to fall into one of those categories. And if you think about it, there's probably it's potential everybody in the organization is either defining data as part of their job or producing data or certainly using data to make decisions. So we need to create, one of the things that we should consider when we're balancing access is give people access that aligns with their level of responsibility that they have. Make certain that they're aware of, if they're defining data, there's specific guidelines and rules that they need to follow. If they're using data, without a doubt, there's certain access guidelines and rules that they need to follow if they're using the data. So certainly, having role-based accountability is certainly one of the things to consider when you're balancing data access with governance policies. And I talk about policies, and I've worked with enough organizations to see that people view data policies as being roadblocks, things that get in the way. And if they're sold to the organization as being that, then it's no wonder that people in the organization feel that they're roadblocks. But if we provide them to people as kind of the guardrails, help them, and the analogy is perfect. To make them feel like clear lanes on the highway, keep people safe in their use of data, and compliant, but still allow them to get to where they need to go quickly. So policies should guide, not restrict. And so we, as practitioners of governance and practitioners of policy, need to make our policies easier for people to follow. If you provide them in a shelf-worthy document, they're going to be left on the shelf, and people are going to only access them if they're forced to, or if they're asked to get a better understanding of the policy. Another consideration for balancing access is all those things that I mentioned earlier when I talked about the data catalyst and the data catalyst effect, because governance kind of builds the formality in the organization, it builds the strength, but it's only going to gain that strength if people change their behavior or they start to recognize their behavior as being important to the successful implementation of governance. So governance gains its strength through getting people to change their behavior through change management. And if you recall, I mentioned data catalyst being that, again, being the governance, specifically non-invasive data governance, and change management and data literacy together. because that's what's going to lead to real impact across the organization. If people become literate with data that they can trust and that they understand, and we can get them to change their behaviors associated and follow rules and guidelines, it's going to have a big effect on the organization. And again, like I said, it's a catalyst to accelerate things to happen more than just being a passive enabler of data appropriate activities within the organization. I mentioned the idea of being stealth, and it kind of goes hand in hand with the idea of being non-invasive. That we're not going to bolt this on to what people do. We don't really want it to feel as though it's something that's additional responsibility to them. Let's just build it in to what they already do. I think one of the best ways that it's been described by people is let's just meet people where they are and build governance into the things that they do. It's certainly going to help them to avoid resist. It's going to get them to avoid being resistant to change because it's things that they already do or that they most likely should be responsible for, just kind of build into the things that they're doing. So policies really work best when they're embedded quietly into the organization rather than something that's being held up front and say, okay, you have to follow this policy and that policy. That's still true, but we need to find some way to embed it more quietly and reduce the resistance people have to wanting to be governed or to looking at policy as being something that's being bolted on to the things that they presently do. All right, let's talk about some considerations for ensuring data integrity and quality in this era of democratized data. And as I mentioned before, good inputs lead to good outputs. We want to talk about stewardship without assignment. There's a better word than assigning people to be data stewards. Um, I've shared often in the webinar series something that I refer to as a common data matrix, and I want to share it again just as an idea of something that could be an anchor for any quality initiatives and democratization issues that you have or challenges that you have in your organization. And then I want to talk about measuring trust and not volume around the ensuring data integrity and quality. So good, as I mentioned before, good inputs lead to good outputs. Um, Democratized access, it only creates value to the organization when, as I said, the people trust the data and people are trusted to know the data well enough to use it appropriately. And everything that's happening in our IT environments, in our information, in our AI environments is basically amplifying any flaws in the data. So we've got to get the data to be of good quality. We need the good inputs to lead to the good outputs. So trusted data is not something that is, oh, we'll take care of that later if we're going to democratize. We need trusted data to be something that's non-negotiable if we're going to give people access to the data this way. And the governance ensures that the access to the data is built on quality. Again, knowing the right person at the right time, getting access to the right data with the right definitions. Boy, we certainly hope that will lead to better decisions being made within the organization, or at least, should I say, improved decisions being made. I talked a little bit about stewardship assignment. There's already people that have these activities in the organization. One of the another consideration for ensuring quality, integrity, and quality is to activate these people who are already active with the data. There's already a lot of people in the organization that are taking care of the data. Let's formalize that accountability. Again, that's one of the core tenets and the ideas of the non-invasive approach. Everybody already stewards data informally. Let's get them, even in our new democratized environment, to steward it formally, to understand what their relationship to the data is, and to help them to be more successful, or to get more benefit from these relationships people have to the data. Now, I know you can't read this diagram. I'm going to make it bigger here in a minute, but there are simple ways in an organization where you can start mapping people to the roles that are associated with your data governance program. And I refer to it as a common data matrix. Another name for it that people have given, that clients have given it, is the inventory and the accountability matrix. And you'll see exactly why here in a minute. But we need to map who is touching which domains or subject areas of data across the organization. And when we map who touches what domains and which parts of the organization are using those domains, it creates a level of clarity. It reduces duplication of effort. It strengthens consistency. Certainly by having information collected about who does what with the data, it's going to have a positive impact on democratization of data in your organization. So we want to clarify who defines the data, produces, and uses the data. And to be honest with you, it's just a basic, simple spreadsheet. And I'm going to make the spreadsheet a little bit bigger here. I do want to walk through it with you for a second. If you look across the top of the spreadsheet, it's basically the different parts of the organization. You've got an IT branch. You've got in this case, this common data matrix was set up for a university for what they refer to as location data within the organization, within the university, within the institution. So we focused here in this example only on facility management, and planning parts of the organization, but each part of the organization could be broken into different pieces of that division within the organization. If you look down the left-hand side, it focuses on different domains or subject areas of data. So under the location data, there was site data. If you can see where I'm pointing, building data, floor data, and then even within site data, there's campus code data. There's specific data elements associated with the subdomain of site data within the location data. And some of that data is recognized as being critical. There's a criteria in that organization to determine what critical data is, and the campus code falls under critical data. And if you can notice, for every piece of data that's identified in this common data matrix, where there's a yes, it lists what are the different systems that data is used in and or is part of, and who the IT resource owner and a business analyst resource owner within IT is. But then it also goes further to say, okay, well, how are we democratizing the use of data across the organization? In facility management, in each of the three different areas of facility management, they're using data from all three of those sources. I've seen organizations, instead of putting X's in the block, putting people's names. Out of all the webinars and all the papers and all the articles and things that I've written, the number one most requested tool is this one, because it puts your arms around how data is already democratized, who's using what data, where they're using that data from. Again, I don't want to spend the rest of the webinar talking about this. I could do that, but I still have a whole bunch of things to go through. But a tool like this is helpful for you. That's why I say it's called an inventory and accountability matrix as well, where we can inventory the data within a specific domain and identify, who's accountable for that data across the organization. All right, anybody who wants more information about this can certainly reach out to me at any time. And the last consideration for ensuring data integrity and data quality in this new era is, and it's something that's one of my pet peeves, is people are measuring outputs instead of measuring outcomes that are related to those outputs. So counting the data products and things that you're developing is not enough. The volume metrics might be important to you. It shows you that things are being accomplished, but is it really what the executives care about? They care about what are the outcomes, what decisions are being made, how are we getting the right information to the right people at the right time quicker. They want to know the outcomes. They're not necessarily interested in counting the outputs. All right, the last thing, and I'm going to kind of jump through this relatively quickly, and then I do want to get to the end where I'm sharing with you some examples of where different types of organizations have democratized their data and some of the specific actions that they've taken and how that's been beneficial to them. But the last thing I want to talk to you about here is about empowering employees. So how do we go about empowering employees in this age of data democratization? Geez, while safeguarding the data and making sure that we're protecting the data. So that empowerment is going to need to come with guardrails. We need to make people more data literate across the organization. That's really one of the keys to safe access to data. We want to focus on accountability for data. That's going to be important in the age of data democratization and how we take a non-invasive approach to it. And again, that whole concept of governance as being an accelerant instead of being viewed as a restrictor within the organization is an important concept. Again, if people see governance as being a restriction, rather than something that's going to help them and accelerate them to do more or to make better decisions. If it's being sold to them that way, we need to change that tune a little bit. So let's talk about the empowerment coming from the guardrails. Employees, at least from my experience, employees tell me that they thrive when they're given broader access to the data. But they also understand that empowerment that it requires that there's some level of boundaries. So I've kind of highlighted that whole line. And it's something to consider that employees are going to thrive. They're going to do better when they have broader access to the data, but that empowerment requires that we have levels of governance. Like I mentioned earlier with that one statement, democratization is going to require more governance and more boundaries rather than present a need to get rid of those boundaries or those guidelines. Employees want broad access, but they also want clear limits. The guardrails need to be put in place to protect sensitive data while enabling people to get the use out of the data that they need. So that empowerment succeeds when the safety and that freedom to get to the data, they kind of work hand in hand and they coexist. Data literacy is a big part of it. Data literacy is the third piece of the data catalyst idea of governance and change management and literacy. Um, Democratization without people having understanding of the data leads to confusion, or it certainly leads to misuse of the data. If we're going to get people to be more literate, it means that we need to also govern our metadata. We need to provide through data cataloging tools or whatever tools we have available to us, the understanding of the data. We need to work with people to get them to understand how the data can be used or should be used or shouldn't be used. So literacy certainly ensures that not only is the data understood, but it's not being misused in the organization. In literacy, you'll see oftentimes it requires training to empower people on the staff within your organization to act responsibly. I've talked about non-invasive data governance. I always talk about non-invasive data governance. Just because we want to safeguard the data, just because we want to govern the data, doesn't mean that we need to add something that's going to be burdensome to the organization, that's going to feel over and above what people are presently doing. So safeguarding the data, as that top line says, doesn't mean that we need to add burdensome oversight to that data. It doesn't require heavy oversight. Using a tool like the Common Data Matrix, where we can see who has access to what data. We can even use the Common Data Matrix to identify and recognize what data is sensitive in the organization, what data needs to be safeguarded. Again, you need to know who does what with the data, and the Common Data Matrix is a way for you to start to recognize those people in the organization who are already defining, producing, and using data. And that's really, again, what non-invasive data governance is all about, is how do we get people in the organization to understand that governance isn't new, it's part of what they already do. Let's help them to do it better. Let's take a non-invasive approach. Let's formalize existing accountability rather than handing people things that they don't already have, or hitting them over the head with a 2x4 or a hammer and saying, okay, we're going to now assign you into a new role. Let's stay away from the word assign. Let's use the word recognize. There's already people in the organization that have relationships to the data. Let's recognize who they are and help to formalize their levels of accountability. Again, taking a non-invasive approach. And I talked about governance as being an accelerant, as being that catalyst. Employees get more engaged when they don't think of governance as being something that's a roadblock to success, when they feel like it's going to be a support system to them to help them to define the data and produce and use the data better. So certainly governance works when people see it as being more of a support system rather than it being a roadblock to success. Um, and by the way, while we're making policies and we're building policies as a big part of governance, Policies should be focused on making people's lives easier, not making their life harder. All right, we're going to jump right into the case studies because I think we have 5 minutes left. So I've got a few minutes to talk about a couple different organizations. And the first one is a field that I really like to work in a lot, which is higher ed. And so I'm going to just share this case study. And this organization that I worked with, they were looking to improve the way that they advise students on the courses that they take, on how they should enroll, when they should enroll. So what they did was they focused their data democratization on improving student advising. And a couple of the things that they did, the specific actions, and that's kind of how these slides read, is that it starts out with, okay, this is what they were setting out to do. They did it through standardizing their course and enrollment definitions. They did it by establishing what I had mentioned, a role-based stewardship. Instead of recognizing stewards as being something new, let's recognize people for what they already do. And again, there's a definition or an explanation of what I mean by establishing role-based data stewardship. You'll get copies of the slides when Shannon and DATAVERSITY send you the slides within a couple of business days. A couple other things with this case study is they implemented more quality controls and validation rules around the data. Can't get the roles and the rules mixed up, but they implemented quality controls and the validation rules in the organization. They also linked governance to outcomes rather than just the number of stewards that were recognized or the number of policies that were passed or the number of processes that fell under governance. These are all great things to have counts of, but as I said towards the end of this webinar, focus on the outcomes. Don't focus on the outputs. The outputs are very easy to measure. Where there's a challenge is how do we show that it's changed people's behavior and that it's had an impact, an outcome impact on the organization. Here's another example from a public sector, from the public sector. And I also can think of several of these even from the legal profession where they balanced this open access. They wanted to give access to the data to everybody, but they had to balance it with some level of compliance. So one of the organizations created a tiered access policy. They tried to do data governance kind of under the radar, as I had mentioned, kind of integrating kind of a more stealthy or not something that's being highlighted as, oh, you're following governance now. No, you're doing governance because you have a relationship to the data that we need to hold you formally accountable for. They established compliance dashboards. They linked, as I mentioned before, they linked governance to outcomes that were associated with citizens that were really their customers. Basically, again, remembering that this is a public sector case study. In the financial services, organizations used things like the common data matrix to define, produce, and to recognize who defines, produces, and uses data across the organization. Their intention was to align access with risk management across the organization. The first thing they needed to do was to understand what data they had and who was accessing what data. And that's what they used the common data matrix to do. They also embedded some risk indicators into things like their anti-money laundering, their know your customer initiatives, their GDPR initiatives within the organization. Again, they took a less of an invasive approach. They kind of embedded these things into the policies and then into the practices. They automated data lineage tracking. They showcased governance as being something that was really costing that was costing them a lot of money, but they kind of highlighted it as a way to demonstrate cost savings to the organization as well. Then there's a healthcare example, and there's a lot of case studies that you can look up online about how giving people access to data this way, in this age of data democratization, what are some of the activities that these organizations have done in order to achieve their goal? So in this healthcare, in this hospital system, it's a pretty large hospital system. Their focus was on supporting the care teams, the nurses, the doctors, the staff, and providing them with good data. And they found that the data was defined a lot of different ways. So they created more uniform definitions for the data. They took the people who were defining the data and producing the data and using the data, and they formalized their responsibilities. They built privacy into the governance policies. They connected governance to patient outcomes, if you can see, there's a consistent message here. Don't measure outputs, measure outcomes, because that's what your executives care about. Outputs may be important. We're getting a lot of stuff done, but what impact is it having on the organization? And the last case study, and you could probably look this up for many organizations that are in the process of using both structured and unstructured data to train their models for AI. So they need to focus on making certain that that structured data or unstructured data, documents, content, records, emails, whatever format the unstructured data takes place, they're starting to govern that data to make certain that it's valid and that it can be trusted. And they're using that data specifically to train their large language models. So they curated their data sources, they applied governance to unstructured data in a similar way that they applied it to structured data. They introduced testing that could focus on finding where there were biases in the data, where there were problems with the quality. And the idea was, again, to be kind of stealth and make AI governance kind of transparent to the organization, but to assure that there were good inputs that were feeding into these models and things that they were going to be doing analytics against. So, Mark, I think we're right up against the time. I just want to summarize here real quickly. Thank you, everybody, for taking time listening to me rant and rave about data and AI governance in the age of data democratization. I talked about a few things before we got started, but I really started to focus on the challenges that democratizing data are going to present to us and some ideas for how to address those challenges. We talked about balancing data access with the policies that are always a part of governance, ensuring that the data that people get their hands on is trusted and that we can entrust the employees and the people that are using the data to know the data well enough to give them access to the data. And then I kind of wrapped up with some success stories around governance. And there's a lot more of them. If you know where to look online, go look. And I think you see it. The data democratization is something that's really starting to catch hold in a lot of organizations. Certainly now in this era of data and AI governance, we need to pay attention to it and make certain that we're governing the data appropriately. And with that, Mark, I'm going to turn it back to you. See if anybody's still awake or if there's any questions today.
We have a couple of questions, and actually, we got a couple of direct messages that I'm actually kind of really excited to hear your take on them, and I think I have opinions as well. Um,
Good.
but we've got this one questioner here who is enamored with the common data matrix as I am. And they were wondering, define, produce, use data. Would you consider adding protecting data as a separate element of the common data matrix? From the security point of view, should we use this as another reminder for folks who protect their data security? They went to add on that maybe we're splitting hairs with that kind of designation. But what are your thoughts there?
You know what? I don't think that's the first time that somebody has presented that to me. My first reaction was no, we don't need that's using the data. So protecting the data is again making the right sure that only the right people get access to the data. Protecting the data includes letting people that do have access to the data know what they can do with that data and who they can share that data with or who they
Hmm.
can't share that data with. So again, I just look at protecting the data. You know what? I like the idea in terms of calling it out as one of the key aspects of using the data is protecting the data. I don't know if it's necessary. I kind of like the clean look of the define, produce, and
Hmm.
use, but it's really up to the individual. If they think that calling out protect is important enough, specifically in a risk management and security environment, that I would say go for it. Add it to it. Again, nothing that I tell you is etched in stone. I would say find a way to incorporate protection of data into the common data matrix. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Uh, hey Bob, like every time I've implemented a common data matrix anywhere, I've always made cultural changes to better fit an organization. And if somebody's starting up a data governance program and data security is a key factor of that, it doesn't hurt to call out something like that if it's going to have a huge
And
cultural impact at an organization, right?
especially if it becomes part of the language that you're using. We could say define, produce, and use. Yeah, that covers most of what data management involves. But protecting the data, we're going to specifically call that out. I like that idea. I may
Well,
not start using it, but I like the idea.
it's a bit of a narrative on this question that we got by DM, but I don't mean that out of disrespect to the questioner. I think it's a wonderful question. But as I work in the private public sector, they say some of the data we manage has significant legal protections. Not only does data security and access have to meet strict security requirements, there are several federal notification requirements that are tied to how our data is used and shared. So sometimes data sharing can take years, they're saying. But what are the tips that you would have for changing the culture?
You know what? Sometime, and I've worked with some federal government agencies where data access was everything about data governance, and this was really kind of preceded the AI governance and world. Um, but I mean, I think that start with the question again, Mark. I'm sorry, I started off on the wrong note here.
Uh, uh, so they're talking about significant regulatory and security requirements as it relates to using data within the public sector, especially in the area that they work in.
Well, and it
And
was
they're
about
having
the amount of
trouble kind of managing that, and how do we get data in people's hands faster instead of years and years and years? How do we change the culture? Um,
Well, I mean, the idea of getting the data into people's hands faster is always good, but it comes with some risk, as I mentioned during the webinar.
mhm,
So speed is important, and the government agency that I started to talk about, just a request for data would take months and months or even a year, like the person who asked the question had said. People don't have that amount of time. They need data now. But that means that we need to do a better job of setting up the foundational building blocks to
yep.
know who the person is. Let them know, should they have access to this data? Is there a data catalog? Is there a dictionary, a glossary that defines the data? Does it tell people how to use the data? Yeah, access to data quickly is great, but it also poses significant risk. I think it is a cultural thing. We
Hmm.
can't slow down completely and say, no, we're not going to give people access. There are some organizations that do that. And then there's other organizations that take the exact opposite approach and say, we're going to give access to everybody, to everything. Boy, that's a risky proposition too.
Yeah.
So I think we need to recognize what data needs the quick access and focus on building those foundational blocks for that data first.
Hmm.
And then I think we'll at least be able to respond a little bit quicker than a couple months or a couple years, because people don't want to wait that long.
Oh, for sure. What I like about your presentation today, Bob, is because you're talking about policies and guidelines and standards and things, and as a guide rail or a guardrail. I think that's one of the areas that can help people who are stuck in this culture where nobody feels like it's safe to use data. Well, there's no guardrail in place for people to understand how data is safely used. I think if there is assistance in getting uh, 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 the mists or the fogs of how data can safely be shared out of the minds of folks, then it might be more amenable to using the data over time.
Yeah, the people want data now, and
Exactly.
it's very risky. And if since we're talking about democratization and keep going back to the definition that I provided, getting it into the trusted data,
Hmm.
in making it accessible. Geez, that's difficult enough as it is, but getting it to the right people. So I mean, the people that will use it the most, but
Hmm.
I think that also intends to not get it to the wrong people, right? I think it's
Yeah.
implied in there. And so
You
it's
could
a
have your Bill of
risk
Rights
management
up here,
approach.
Bob. Your
You're right, Bill of Rights. Right. I talked about it a little bit in the webinar, but I haven't used it in a while. But again, getting the right people to have access to the right data at the right time with the right definition, the right understanding, it leads to making the right decisions. Anything that's not right about that potentially leads to a risk and leads to wrong decisions.
Exactly. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful presentation today, Bob. We got 1 minute. I'll ask one more question at risk of
Okay.
going over.
Okay.
Um, how to manage AI output bias? What are some questions to ask analytics teams conducting AI analysis from a data governance perspective?
I hate to end on a sour note, but I'm really not the best person to answer that question. And I think that there are a lot of resources that you can go to see what questions that can be asked to determine a level of bias. I think it's a
Hmm.
great question. I think it could
Yeah.
even be, boy, Mark, we could extend the webinar series into next year and just talk about data governance and bias. I think that's a fascinating subject. Sorry, I don't have a whole lot of an answer, but if the person who asked that question wants to reach out, let's have a conversation about it. Let's find some resources that define those answers.
Yeah, I think you're right, Bob. It could be a whole webinar too.
Right, 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 right.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for attending the webinar and all the wonderful questions and electric chat as always. You guys are always so active in there. So thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks again, Bob.
Hey, thank you, and thank you, everybody. Look forward to seeing you next month.